Okay, so I was able to do the first part of Article 1 through Section 7, and now we're going to, I hope, with enough time, we'll finish up with Article 1, and once that is done, then we will be having a test over Article 1. So let's begin. We're looking at Article 1, Section 8, and these are what's known as the enumerated powers. These powers are spelled out in the Constitution for the legislature. It's their, basically the things they are allowed to make laws about. And that's the reason why we have a name over here called Powers of Congress. All right, so we're going to begin with Clause 1. This is, when we say clause, we're basically talking about the paragraph. And for our purposes right now, this is really something that you only need to know with relationship to these powers. So Clause 1, this is about taxes. Congress has the power to tax and to spend money for the national defense and general welfare. National defense is pretty self-explanatory. General welfare is all the things that are necessary in order to make the government run. It's the general welfare for the country, right? Taxes are at the heart of these powers, because without the money gotten from taxes, government wouldn't be able to do anything. So obviously that would be a good reason why that was number 1 on the list of powers that they decided. All right, number 2 is borrowing. Borrowing has to do with the opportunity to borrow money to complete whatever task they wish to do. And unfortunately, in this day and age, we owe a lot of money. I think most everybody is aware that we owe trillions of dollars. But the part that's important to note here is the Constitution makes it an absolute obligation to repay any debt. Doesn't say how fast they have to repay it, but they do have to pay it back. And that's this term known as repudiate or repudiation. They cannot, the Congress cannot repudiate or refuse to recognize or pay any bill that was legitimately gained. All right, so borrowing is possible, and they have to repay if they do borrow. Number 3, this is called regulation of commerce. This is an extremely important clause because it covers so much in the way of business and people's movement. And so, in fact, that's what this says. It covers the movement of people and things across state lines and every form of communication and transportation. So that includes not only the ability to cross state lines without having to have a passport and all those things, but it also covers the things that cross the state line, like our food and our technology and just being on vacation. All of those things are covered under the regulation of commerce. That also includes the communication. That would mean anything from a telephone to or your cell phone to a computer, the internet, so on. Anything that has to do with communication, the movement of newspaper, all of those things, television, all of those follow under communication. And of course, transportation, that would be anything that had to do with cars or trains or buses or semis, anything that might have to do with transportation can be regulated under this idea of commerce. And this is known as the Commerce Clause. Very famous, very important. All right, the next few have to do with, in number 4 in particular, has to do with who can become a citizen of the United States. The Constitution says that the Congress can define the requirements to become a citizen. And a citizen, you have to take classes, you have to pass a test, you have to fulfill the requirements that have been set by Congress. And only the federal government or Congress can determine who becomes a citizen. The states have no right to do that. It's only the feds. Now, in addition, in this clause, and I'm not quite sure why, but they do have the included in this bankruptcy. And what it says here is Congress has the right to create the provisions for failure to pay debt. Purpose behind this was to make sure that if debts were not paid, that they could not play the game that the king would a king might play, where you would be thrown in prison until you could pay, which makes no sense considering you're in prison and can't make money. So that was a serious offense and a serious crime that the king perpetrated on the colonists, and so they felt they had to make sure that that was not part of this. But they also said, you know, you have to pay debt. And so what they did is they made provisions. If you were unable to pay debt, then there was a way through bankruptcy to cover debt. All right, let's move on to 5. 5 is money, and money is, in this case, is all about how to make money. Congress, and only Congress, can coin or make money and issue money. They have established several locations throughout the United States. Those locations are called mint, and those mints are they are responsible for making money. Cincinnati has one, and there are several around the country, Denver, New York. All those are locations to keep track of and make money and issue money. Now, the Federal Reserve is the organization that regulates money for the country. In other words, they are the ones that are responsible for making sure that our economy doesn't tank, and they make sure by regulating how much money is out in the public, making sure that they prevent too much money from being out there, which would cause the money to lose value, or too little money out there, which would cause it to raise and be difficult to pay for. The value of money would cause, if it's too high, would cause it, make it difficult for people to pay bills and cover with the limitation of how much money is worth. So the important thing to remember is the Federal Reserve regulates money. Congress, and only Congress, can make the money and issue the money. All right, so counterfeiting. Counterfeiting goes right along with money in that they wanted to make sure that the money system was protected and that the counterfeiting of money would be punished, and clearly stated that it's illegal to make money, try to make our money other than through Congress. So if you do, then you stand an excellent chance of being convicted of a crime, and it's a pretty serious crime. It is a felony. All right, number 7, this is the post office. The post office was a major part of our road system. So it says here, it establishes a system of post office to ensure safe and speedy transit of information and communication. So because of this, it made it important to be able to establish a system of roads that would make that speedy transport possible. Without that, then information and communication would bog down. Well, in today's world, with thanks to internet and those things, being on the road isn't as necessary, but we still need to receive all the things that we need from the post office. And so that transportation is extremely important for them. Now, one of the first systems of roads was our own national road. It was a post road made possible by the federal government to ensure that movement of information and to be able to communicate as quickly as possible. Also, it's noted that if you misuse the post office, there is punishment for it, and it is a federal crime. So if you, and there unfortunately was a rash a few years ago of what was pipe bombs placed in people's mailboxes that would blow up, and so it caused people harm. There's also people who think it's quite funny to go along a road, take a baseball bat to um, the um, mailboxes, which again is illegal, and if you're caught, you could be in some serious trouble because this is misuse of the federal post office. All right, number 8, patents and copyrights. Some of you may be in violation of this if you've ever downloaded anything without paying for it. This is the federal government establishes protection of copyright and patent protection of authors and inventors' work. That includes movies, that includes videos, that includes music, and any number of other things that are people's property. If you do research and you pull off information off the internet and you put it in a paper and call it your own, that's illegal. It is not. It is, first of all, it's plagiarism, and second of all, it is a violation of patents and copyrights. All right, number 9, courts. Now, we're going to see when we get to Article 3 that the founding fathers established the judicial branch, but they made very little, they noted very little in order to explain what the judicial branch is. They really left it up to the legislative branch to create the different courts that would exist in the judicial branch. So it's up to the Congress to organize the branch, but once they've organized it, then the running of the branch belongs to the judicial branch. But Congress can create lower inferior courts to the Supreme Court and set jurisdiction and its duties. Okay. So let's move on to, oops, I'm sorry, 8, 9, okay, there we go, 10. All right, so now we have this punishment of piracies and felonies committed on the high seas. Every nation possesses these powers. If you are caught by a nation having committed a crime on the high seas, every nation has the right to punish you. So just because you are an American, if you are outside the American waters, and for example, you have traveled to Spain and you commit a crime near Spain, they can deal with you. So it is still out there. Punishing piracies and felonies committed on the high seas are a power of our government as well as almost every other government in the world. If you've ever seen the movie Captain Phillips, this is a perfect example of the dealing with pirates. This happened in Somalia, and if you get a chance, watch the movie. It's pretty good. All right, the next one is declare war. Declare war. The right to declare war, the right to declare war is a power only given to the Congress. Now, that doesn't mean the president can't and does send troops off to war. He can, and when we get into Article 2, which is the executive branch, we'll see that he has a great deal of power with regards to the movement of troops. But an official declaration of war can only come from the Congress. That's only happened 2 times, World War I and World War II. All right, 12 and 13 I put together because it simply means it's the raising and supporting of an army, and it's the raising and supporting of a navy. Okay, now 14 then goes with that to make rules for the government and regulation of land and naval forces. All this is that they get to make decisions about any government land and any regulations that relate to the military. 15, they can call the militia. Now, in this case, we're talking, the militia actually is a state organization. It's similar to the reserves, what we call the reserves today. The federal government can call them. Any military is still ultimately part of the federal government. But number 16 then says they also are expected to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining of the military forces. They can be called by the states, but it is always still under the control of this power of Congress. That's what subordinate means. All right, so the Congress is expected to support by providing for organizing, arming, and disciplining of the military. All right, 17. This is the governing of the District of Columbia. It is delegated to locally elected government because what was originally planned was that the Congress would govern the District of Columbia. But unfortunately, Congress got busy doing many other things, and it became difficult to do that. So ultimately, they finally delegated it to the elected officials, and they now have pretty much control of the District of Columbia. Congress, as part of 17, Congress also governs forts, arsenals, and other places obtained from the states for federal government purpose. So areas like, let's say, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, that is federally governed. It is not in any way governed by Dayton or the state of Ohio. It is governed by the federal government. All right, moving on. This next portion is extremely important, and bear with me as I try to explain this. 18, this is the clause known as the necessary and proper clause. It is for Congress the right to make laws that shall be necessary and proper. In other words, they were thinking about the future. So they provided it by enabling Congress to use any means it thinks reasonable to create laws that are needed for current crime. So this clause authorized Congress to enact legislation necessary to carry out the powers of other branches. So it is a very broad clause. For example, Congress, it will, and I already talked about this to a small degree, organizes the judicial branch. It can determine the number of Supreme Court justices. It can also establish the executive departments and activities that would have been violations of the separation of powers without the necessary and proper clause. Meaning that in this case, the organization and the establishment of these different pieces that are part of the Constitution, the executive branch and the judicial branch have to be organized in some way. The founding fathers left that to Congress, but once it's organized, then it belongs to each individual branch. Okay, so this is known as the elastic clause. All right, I'm going to keep going here because this is all part of it. So this elastic clause is the basis for also all the legislative branches' implied powers, powers not explicitly listed in the Constitution but held to be legitimate because they are necessary and proper for Congress to exercise the other powers that are listed there. All right, this is where it gets confusing. The point I'm trying to make, if we can keep this as simple as possible, this clause allows Congress to make law that is not necessarily specifically noted in the Constitution. What they're saying, though, is that in order to make law, the Congress has to have some way to connect it to the 17 powers that we just talked about. So let's use an example of the computer. If you remember, we will go all the way back to regulation of Congress. Computers did not exist when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution. However, they were forward enough thinking that they knew things were going to change, things would happen. So they wrote it in broad enough terms that when you think about it, the computer is, in fact, a means of communication. So therefore, it can be regulated and laws be made with regards to the computer by the federal government. So what I'm saying is that there had to be a way that the Congress could continue to make law after, well, throughout the 200 and some years, 225 years, 35 years now, that they would have no earthly idea that there would need to be law. Okay, so what I'm saying is the all of the new and different things that have happened over the past couple centuries, there had to be a way to make law. And so this allows Congress to make the laws about whatever's necessary. But they limited it. Remember, we've got limited government, principle of government. They limited them to only those things that they were given power to cover, which would be the 17 things that we just talked about. So, although these are not spelled out, they are in fact implied powers. Implied, of course, means not explicitly listed or not absolutely shown. It's implied. So this, now we have two names for this clause. The elastic clause, actually three names if you want to go be specific. The elastic clause and the necessary and proper clause. Those describe the clause. Then implied powers talks about what are the powers that are part of the elastic clause. Well, these are implied powers, those things that aren't specifically listed and yet are connected to the powers, that enumerated powers that have been given by the founding fathers. In order to be able to make law, there has to be a link, though, to the power listed in the Constitution. This indeed can be very controversial, depending on the interpretation of the Constitution. It is always dependent on that. Some people wish to interpret the Constitution very loosely. Some tend to want to interpret it very strictly. And so that can also be connected to some of what we see today. The liberal, those people who are liberal are usually those who look at the Constitution and interpret it very loosely. Conservatives tend to interpret the Constitution very strictly, and sometimes then you have a lot of controversy as a result of this. All right, let's keep going. All right, Section 9. We have two more sections to go, so let's see if we can get her done here. Section 9. These are restrictions on congressional power. So they, in this, of course, the slave trade is long past, but it is still something to note that they included that the importation of slaves from outside the United States was going to end in 1808. That didn't end slave trade. It just merely stopped the importation of this. Section 9 also included the habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a term or device, if you will, used by jailed people to require their jailer to justify their imprisonment into a court. In other words, they cannot, the purpose is you cannot be imprisoned and then never have to say why. So habeas corpus is still used, often used today, for people to make sure that whoever has jailed them has to justify why they are in jail. Now, in addition to habeas corpus, there is something called prohibition of bill of attainder and an ex post facto. So I define this here. Bill of attainder was a legislative act declaring the guilt of an individual or a group of persons and punishing them. Bill of attainder was, instead of dealing with an individual or when they have committed an act, instead it was declaring the guilt of a group and punishing them without the opportunity for a trial. So that is illegal and is not to be accepted in our society. The next one is ex post facto, and this is declaring an act illegal after it's been committed, or increases the punishment for an offense already being committed. This is, for example, the first person who ever hacked a computer. There was no law against it, and so therefore there was no punishment for it. However, once the law existed, then a person could be punished once they committed it. But you cannot go back. You cannot go back and you cannot go back and um, call somebody who has committed the act before the the law has been created. So only after the law has been created can someone be punished for an act that they've committed, again, after the law has been created. All right, moving on. Next one is Congress cannot favor one state over another while regulating trade. This is pretty self-explanatory. You can't have a favorite. Okay, the next one is departments and agencies cannot spend money that has not been appropriated by Congress and may not use money for any purpose except what has been specified. All this is that they are not allowed to spend money without first getting approval. And that's extremely important. So Congress has to approve monies being spent. Okay, last one. No one holding an office may keep gifts, titles, or offices from any king, prince, or foreign state. You cannot, are not allowed to keep any if you are holding an office. You can, in fact, it in fact belongs to the people. And so when you see some of these, if some of you have seen some of these presidential libraries, those things are things that were presented to the president, but in fact they are on loan from the people to the presidential library. When you go into, when you were in 8th grade and went to DC, you saw some of those things possibly at the Library of Congress or at different places in some of these different federal buildings, things that were given by other countries to maybe our president or vice president or so on. All right, the last one I want to go over is Section 10. This is, Section 10 is all about the protecting of the nation. To protect national powers from state interference, no state may make a treaty, alliance, or confederation. In other words, only the national government should be able to make decisions with other nations, treaties, alliances, and so on. And then finally, without the consent of Congress, no state may lay any duty of tonnage. That's called imports. And imports, which are taxes, that are taxed, they go to the federal government. No state may keep troops, and they can do reserves, but remember, they are ultimately responsible to the national government. They may not have ships in times of peace, warships, ships of war in times of peace, and they cannot engage in war unless actually invaded or imminent danger exists. So those are federal or national government's expectations or in order to protect the nation. So Section 10 is all about making sure that the states there are limitations on the powers of states. All right, so that finishes Article 1. And I'm going to be setting up a study guide for you, and you guys will then need to complete the study guide and be prepared for a test.